What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou from the Duran, and I have with me Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. And today we're going to be taking a look at American exceptionalism as defined by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Okay, we are here with Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. Mark, what did you make of Mike Pompeo's speech at the German Marshall Fund? Was it spot on? Was it a bit too arrogant? Was it realistic? Was it fantasy? Give us your take on what Pompeo said. Was it ambitious? Was it brave?
Alex, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be at the Duran. So in the past week, Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State for the Trump administration now, he went to Brussels to a meeting of the German Marshall Fund. And the German Marshall Fund is a think tank and grant organization that's been around, since shortly after the Cold War. And its primary purpose is, officially its primary purpose is to promote transatlantic relations, particularly between the U.S. and Germany. What the German Marshall Fund actually does, its real role is to promote U.S. foreign policy agenda in Germany and to train up the next generation of German leaders in politics, military, in the business sphere to carry out U.S. foreign policy through Germany. And that's what it does. So he's already speaking to a very, very favorable audience, something that an audience that wants to hear a U.S. restored to its traditional leadership role. And the speech that he gave was entitled "Restoring the Role of the Nation State in the Liberal International Order." And right away, just the title of that speech is going to drive a lot of Europeans crazy. I'm not sure that I would call the speech ambitious. I'm pretty sure that I would call it a slap in the face. A slap in the face to the Europeans, the Germans that he was speaking to, and to just about everyone else in the world who's not Donald Trump. And if you take a look at what Donald Trump promised foreign policy-wise on the campaign trail, it's even a slap in his face. Right? They may have twisted his arm around on that one. So it was an incredibly arrogant, tone-deaf speech. It's perhaps its saving grace is that it is a little bit more honest about what American foreign policy has always been. It just lacks the polish and the little bit of sugar coating to help the pill go down. What the Germans, the other Europeans, they want the U.S. to lead the world. They fully support U.S. global hegemony, military and otherwise. What the Germans want is this little sugar-coated pill. The token effort and the rhetoric of multilateralism in order to help that pill go down and make them feel that there's something at least a little bit more than a client state of the United States. Well, Mike Pompeo did not give them that. He gave them pretty much the exact opposite. Now, there were a few points that I think we could agree with Pompeo on during this speech. And we'll talk about a few of those things there. But when he is continually talking about the nation state, he's driving the Europeans crazy because the European Union, particularly in Western Europe, is pretty much a nation deconstructing machine. That is what it does. It is supposed to take apart the politics and the identity of the individual nation states of the EU and replace it with Brussels technocrats. And one of the things that Mike Pompeo asked during the speech, and it's something that I think we could actually agree with, is the EU ensuring that the interests of countries and their citizens are placed before those of bureaucrats here in Brussels? Well, this couldn't have made the people listening very happy, because those basically are the bureaucrats of Brussels that he was speaking to. And I think we could agree with him that they're not. In fact, I think they would respond that in order for the best interests of the people of the European Union, it's best that those countries go away, and we know better for them what they want. I mean, that's the idea that the European Union has. And in a way, this was exactly what Trump was telling them about the U.S. role in the world. While he was talking about the U.S. Reasserting its sovereignty and putting America first, he was saying that the Europeans should also exert their sovereignty. Caveat, except when it crosses the interests of the United States. If they ever disagree with the interests of the United States, then they don't get their sovereignty. They have to get in line. And that's the message he was delivering there. His job with this speech was to take a few buzzwords from Trump's lexicon: America first, nationalism, the nation state, and then to wed this together in an amalgam, a kind of an abominable amalgamation with the long-standing U.S. foreign policy of exceptionalism and global hegemony, whether it's the version of the neocons or their flip side, the humanitarian imperialists of the Democratic Party. And this is what this speech delivered on. And he said, America intends to lead now and always. And you can take that as a promise. And I think you better take that as a threat, too, because that's exactly the way it was said. And this talk about a liberal international order. Okay, so you have to understand that when Westerners talk about the international order, there's actually two international orders. All right, there is the world order that was at the end of World War II, enshrined in the United Nations Charter, in the UN Security Council, whose principles are sovereignty and non-interference in other countries' affairs. Those are the bedrock principles. Well, on the other side, you have the liberal international order. This is basically the club of Western countries and those countries that bandwagon with them, like, say, South Korea and Japan, and led by the United States. And their dominance, in terms other than just military, started with the Bretton Woods financial and trade agreements, and went all the way up into the construction of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and so on. And one of the things that has been the hallmark of the liberal international order, vice the original world order, where they conflict, is this bedrock question of sovereignty. And all during the 90s and up through today, there has been this attempt to get rid of sovereignty when it conflicts with the interests of the Western countries. And they often cloak this under the ideology that they tried to promote as international law, R2P, the right to protect, which was always applied selectively and hypocritically, and what it actually was, the right to attack countries that don't get in line with our foreign policy. And that's what it really amounted to. So when they talk in the world order, they're not talking the United Nations and international law if it comes into conflict with them. And Trump was very clear on this, or Pompeo, speaking on behalf of Trump, supposedly, was very clear on this. And he was complaining that multilateralism is too often seen as an end to itself. And he's afraid that too many international institutions restrain the United States. And he wants these institutions either abandoned or reformed so that they better serve the interests of the United States. Now, not the interests of the people of Europe, but the interests of the United States. But that's okay, because the U.S. knows best what's best for all of you. If the U.S. runs the world, it will all be much better. We promise. Promise. Guaranteed.
Now, Mark, you mentioned multilateralism and that the Europeans are supportive of multilateralism, correct?
Yes.
What is the difference for our viewers? Explain the difference as to how the Europeans and even the Americans may see a multilateral world. And what's the difference between what we hear a lot of times, the New World Order, multipolar, a world that's split up between different poles, the U.S., Europe, China, Russia. What's the difference between the lateralism and a multipolar world?
Okay, so when we're talking multilateralism, we're talking two things. Multilateralism, right, which is different countries working together, often through institutions that they create together to achieve common long-range goals, with the understanding that they may have to make some compromises and lose out on some short-range
institutions like the IMF or the World Bank. Is this what you're referring to?
The IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union, and so on. The opposite side is unilateralism, and that's really what the United States represents, and that was the whole period of the 90s. And the type of multilateralism that the U.S. promotes is one where the U.S. leads, and they promise to act in the interests of other countries and Europeans, and the European elite, the ruling class, believes that or has often believed that the world is better off with the U.S. leading them. And Pompeo, asserted that multilateralism is too often seen as an end to itself. Now, I don't know anyone who actually believes that. And he took aim at just about every international institution under the sun that have been the hallmark of the way that the U.S. has actually ruled the world, because it has the commanding heights of most of these institutions. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, even the United Nations, right?
Would they have groups like WADA in there, the Olympic Committee? I mean, does this span every type of institution?
Yeah, he took aim at specific institutions. Mm-hmm. And what he tried to highlight is that he thinks that the existing benefits that the U.S. gets from these institutions aren't enough.
Right.
They aren't enough. And, he specifically take a look at the African Union. And he said, is the African Union really serving best the interests of Africans? And what he's implying is that, well, it's not, and it would be much better if we were running the African Union. And that's the way he put this. So when he's saying that a lot of these international institutions are broke, they need reform or they need ripped up, he's right. But where he's wrong is that the world would be much better off if America was making the decisions for everyone. And he took aim at all of these. He took aim at the Organization of American States. He took aim at the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, which the U.S. isn't even a party to, but is all too happy to see used against other countries. He took aim at, let's see here, the International Criminal Court, the World Trade Organization, and he also took a lot of aim at the European Union to the people he was talking to. And some of his critique of the European Union was spot on, when he's talking about the bureaucrats and the countries and their sovereignty. But then his answer to it is that they would be all these institutions would be much better serve the interests of the world if they were restructured to serve the interests of the United States.
Right.
And rather than say, give a better representative opinion, in a multipolar world to those rising countries that increasingly have shares of the economy, the world population, and world power, like, say, China, India, and Russia. And of course, other than taking in shots at these international institutions, he also took shots, of course, at the troika of terror, the current axis of evil, Russia, China, and Iran, and he singled these out as bad actors. So to be clear, that these countries are bad actors. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Qatar, those are not bad actors because they're largely in line with the foreign policy interests of the United States, and that's what's important. And this is nothing new. It's just the upfrontness of the way it's being said. I mean, Madeleine Albright, of the Clinton era, she said, talking about exceptionalism, that Americans stand taller, that America sees further. And implicit is that international law does not apply to the United States, because when the U.S. violates international law, it's for the greater good. Trust us.
So this was Mike Pompeo's speech on exceptionalism, redone, yes. Exceptionalism 2.0.
Exceptionalism with a America first nationalism veneer stamped across of it. But
why would Trump's base be upset at this speech? The base that voted for Trump, a large base that voted for a Trump that's non-interventionist, that is not getting involved in wars in Syria, in Iraq, etc.
When he's talking rhetorically about America first and sovereignty and nation states, that is playing to them, and they should be happy to hear that, right? And Europeans like minds, be that the yellow vests in Europe, the people supporting Brexit in the UK, the new far left, right coalition, Eurosceptic coalition governing Italy, or Viktor Orban in Hungary. Right. And this is one of the big things that the Europeans really didn't like about this speech, is a lot of their criticism of the EU, particularly the parts that were spot on, sounds a lot like Viktor Orban. Now, a lot of Donald Trump's fans on foreign policy, however, liked his talk about ending the policies of regime change, that this sending American military, with their 1,000+ military bases around the world, bombing 9 countries, having special forces in 163 countries or so, that he wanted to end this, that if nothing else, he thought it was wasteful. And counterproductive, and a lot of his followers, really, took that to heart, and that has been a lot of realist critique of U.S. foreign policy for a long time. But this speech does away with all of that, right? It actually, calls for increased U.S. leadership of the world, and they mean particularly of the upfront military, knock down your doors, drop a few bombs on you, and bring you democracy our style. And that, of course, has a tremendous cost, not only to the countries involved, like, say, Libya, which was completely destroyed, Syria, Iraq, but to Americans as well, because they're paying for this. I mean, this is where the $20 trillion+ national debt comes from, right? That every American, at least in theory, owns a part to, and it also pays a cost in the lives of Americans. Your sons, your brothers, your sisters that serve in the military, and that do die overseas when being sent to represent these hegemonic interests, right? And come back crippled, if they come back at all, or damaged with post-traumatic stress disorder from what they've seen and been asked to do. And Americans need to ask themselves, is this really in their interests? Mike Pompeo thinks it is. In fact, he thinks it's in the interests of everyone in the world. I think there's a lot of people in the world, and even in America, that would disagree with him on this.
Now, there's a lot of debate as to who's exactly running the foreign policy right now out of the Trump administration. I tend to believe, and I've had this talk actually with Peter Lavelle, that Trump is not really too involved. He's kind of, outsourced it. But the question that I want your insight on, Mark, is who do you think he's outsourced it to? Has it gone to Bolton? Has it gone to Pompeo? Are they working together? Are they clashing on issues? Is this Pompeo's way of reasserting his control over the State Department and the foreign policy of the U.S.? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I think it's obvious that the neocons have captured U.S. foreign policy and pretty much implemented, in many ways, the opposite of what Trump was promising on the campaign trail, at least foreign policy-wise. And Tillerson was a fairly restrained Secretary of State, focused on internal reform and so on. I actually quite liked him. A lot of people that like America's brash leadership style, when it's done with this sugarcoating of multilateralism, did not like Tillerson, and they were happy to see Pompeo come in. Now, they without the sugarcoating, they may not like it as much. And I think with the question of who exactly is running U.S. foreign policy, I don't think it's just particularly one person. I think Bolton has managed to take control of a lot of it at this point. And I don't know whether they've done this by convincing Trump or by effective blackmail of Trump. It could be either one.
But blackmail in what way?
Well, the Democrats are salivating at the opportunity of impeaching Trump, right, or taking other action against him. They don't have the votes on their own, but there's enough neocons in the Republican Party to swing that. Right. And that is the ultimate leverage over Trump. And be it willingly that he was convinced that they're right, or this type of threats and blackmail, let us control foreign policy and you play around on the domestic things, where it must be said that's not actually where the powers of the U.S. presidency lie. The powers of the U.S. presidency are primarily foreign policy and military, and in charge of the intelligence services, the other large bureaucracies like that. It's Congress who primary powers are domestic policy. I think Bolton has seized a lot of it. I think Bolton and Pompeo are in line on a lot of things. Their hatred of international institutions that they see restraining the U.S. Again, they don't hate all international institutions. In fact, Pompeo specifically pointed out one international institution that he loved, SWIFT. The global financial payment system, and he pointed out exactly why he liked SWIFT and why SWIFT is working the way it should. Because when the U.S. demanded that SWIFT cut off services to Iran after it unilaterally pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was officiated in the UN Security Council resolution and everything, SWIFT, yes, sir, and jumped, and that is what Pompeo wants, and he's just fine with multilateral institutions as long as they work in the interests of U.S. hegemony. And this is where European nationalists like Orban or in Italy or in Britain should be afraid, because if ever what they see as their interests conflict with the United States on that, there goes that sovereignty that that Trump was promising and talking so much about, because it's really America first and America last in terms of this. And again, and that's if your conception of what's good for America and Americans' best interests is a big, bloated, overstretched, extremely expensive U.S. global military financial hegemony on top of the world. And you know, as a vet, I don't exactly see that as being in America's or the world's best interests.
How far of a departure is Mike Pompeo from the Obama administration? Real quick, I mean, are we looking at a drastic departure? It sounds to me that this is not that far off from Obama and Bush and Clinton before then. You know, their concept of hegemony.
Most of the actual difference, most of it, is in tone, is in rhetoric. Now, there are some departures where you could see some of this that could possibly work in America's favor. I mean, the Trump administration did immediately get rid of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, whether it's actually to the U.S. best interest to go to war with Iran, you know, certainly Pompeo and John Bolton do. The NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement was replaced with the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian Agreement. Now, is this actually that much better for Americans? You know, the truth is in the details and in time, but, you know, kind of an initial reading of it, not really. It doesn't actually change that much. And in the long interest, will it actually be better for the American people than NAFTA? And I say that is not a big fan of NAFTA. I don't think so. I think the primary purpose of getting rid of NAFTA and replacing it was making an appeal to his base that he's doing something in their interests while signing Trump in big letters across it. Right. And, you know, we saw this as well with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump tossed it right away, but now they're talking about bringing it back, basically just under another name, again, with Trump names written across it. So in this way, what has really changed from the Obama administration is far more just tone and rhetoric. But again, it's that tone and rhetoric and that swagger and Pompeo. That's Pompeo's favorite buzzword. He tweeted out, "I want to bring some swagger back to the State Department," and he wants to rebrand it as the U.S. Department of Swagger. Well, that he is certainly doing. Whether swagger is actually diplomacy in any stretch of the imagination is another thing entirely. And it's this, you know, a long adage of American foreign policy going back to Teddy Roosevelt is walk softly and carry a big stick, right? Well, the new adage under Pompeo, it would be walk loudly as if your ball sack is 5 times its actual size and beat every single person with your stick, which is a little bit smaller than you think it is, that you come across. And to replace multilateralism with aggressive unilateralism is not really the answer. And, you know, this is this dichotomy. The U.S. foreign policy is often presented as if you don't actively seek U.S. hegemony, then you're an isolationist. It's either, you know, one or the other. There's no realist, you know, middle of the road, you know, cooperation or, you know, compromise when it's in your best interests. No aligning with countries. None of that exists with this type of attitude. And that, you know, this has, you know, been the problem with U.S. diplomacy, not just with the Trump administration. We saw that Samantha Powers and Susan Rice had their own kind of swagger at the United Nations. You know, John Bolton, when he was George H.W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations, and he was the epitome of swagger when he said, you know, that most of the floors of the United Nations could disappear overnight and the world wouldn't notice, while he is the U.S. diplomat to the United Nations. And, you know, Americans have a gut reaction that they kind of like this kind of John Wayne kind of attitude. But again, it's probably not in their best interests. And if you have a U.S. Department of State, you probably actually want it doing some diplomacy rather than acting more militaristic than the Pentagon is. That's a problem, and that's exactly what Mike Pompeo is doing at the State Department.
Good way to sum it up, Mark. Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst via Moscow. Thank you very much for breaking down Mike Pompeo's speech. Guys, if you like this video, click the subscribe button down below and click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, 20% off all throughout December. And remember, you can get a copy of this show on podcast format on iTunes and Soundcloud. Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst, thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.